More than 600,000 Muslims now live in Australia. The story of Islam in Australia is a multifaceted one. Muslim fishermen from Makassar, Sulawesi's main port, began sailing to northern Australia to harvest a delicacy much in demand in China. A number of Muslim convicts from countries such as South Africa, India, Oman and Iraq were also transported to the Australian colonies in the early decades of the 19th century. As followers of Islam, they did not drink alcohol and were therefore favoured as reliable workers by the colonists. As devout Muslims, the Afghans built simple local mosques along their earliest travel routes. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim. This is a series of short videos dedicated to Islam and the relationship between Islam and Australia. More than 600,000 Muslims now live in Australia, supported by some 500 mosques and Islamic community centres. Most Muslim immigration occurred after World War II, either through national development policies or refugee programs for those fleeing from regions in conflict. However, unknown to most outside Australia is the long history of the presence of Muslims there and of the contacts between its Aboriginal people and Islamic religion and culture. Indigenous and Muslim communities have traded, socialised and intermarried in Australia for more than 3 centuries. The story of Islam in Australia is a multifaceted one, longer indeed than that of Christianity, which was introduced with British settlement in 1788. Here we briefly survey this history up to the time of extensive Muslim immigration, which started in the 1950s and 60s, together with the increasing conversions to Islam among the indigenous population. To the north of Australia is the large Indonesian island of Sulawesi, whose rulers converted to Islam in 1604 or 1605. The Dutch, however, considered this powerful sultanate and commercial hub a major threat to their regional dominance and brought it under their control in 1669. In the 17th century, Muslim fishermen from Makassar, Sulawesi's main port, began sailing to northern Australia to harvest a delicacy much in demand in China, a marine creature called tripang or sea cucumber, prized in cooking and for its therapeutic properties. This native trade was permitted by the Dutch. The Macassans, or Malays as they were called, came on yearly return visits, setting up temporary villages and tripang processing sites along the northern coast. Important evidence of these Muslim visitors prior to European colonisation can be found in the Aboriginal art of northern Australia. They also traded goods such as turtle shell, ironwood, sandalwood, pearls and pearl shell in exchange for tobacco cloth, axes, glass, ceramics, fishhooks and knives. The trade continued until the early 20th century. The Macassan prow captains developed close relationships with local Indigenous leaders, and there are several accounts of Macassans fathering children by Aboriginal mothers. Some Muslim fishermen died there. Their graves are carefully orientated towards Mecca. Contact between the two groups was sufficiently intimate and protracted for numerous Malay words to enter local languages, and for Islam to have a significant impact on the belief and customs of the indigenous people. Even before British colonisation, the British East Indies Company hydrographer Alexander Dalrymple reported in 1762 that the Aborigines visited by the tripang fleets were Mohammedans. These interactions led to journeys by Aborigines to Sulawesi. As early as the 17th century, there was a small Aboriginal community in Makassar, and an Aboriginal presence is documented there through the early 20th century. Following British colonisation in the late 18th century, European ships occasionally brought Muslims to Australia. In the 1790s, a group of stranded Muslim seamen were forced to make new lives on Norfolk Island, several later settling in Tasmania. A number of Muslim convicts from countries such as South Africa, India, Oman and Iraq were also transported to the Australian colonies in the early decades of the 19th century. One was a young Malay convict who arrived in Sydney in 1837. Described as of the Malay faith, he had been sentenced in South Australia to 14 years penal servitude in New South Wales. He received his freedom in 1843 and became the first official Muslim resident of Australia. The first significant influx of Muslims to live permanently in Australia was of Cameleers serving the expansion of British settlement in the dry interior. As horses were unsuitable for sustained work there, camels began to be imported for this purpose in the 1860s. Their drivers came from various regions of the Indian subcontinent, as well as Afghanistan. Collectively, they were known as Afghans, although few were actually of Afghan descent. They carried produce, water, mail, and equipment at a time when roads and railways were not constructed, contributing greatly to the development of rural Australia. These Afghans generally lived on the margins of European settlements, at first in makeshift camel camps and later in Ghan towns, that is, Afghan towns. As immigration laws did not allow women or children to accompany them, many worked and lived communally as a brotherhood, observing strict religious practices that tended to discourage social interaction with Europeans. As followers of Islam, they did not drink alcohol and were therefore favoured as reliable workers by the colonists. The Muslim Cameleers often developed enduring relationships with local Aboriginal people. Intermarriage was common, and Afghan graves inscribed in Arabic are still tended to this day by their descendants. Muslim businessmen established their own profitable camel transport enterprises from the late 1880s onwards and came to dominate the sector. However, with the growth of roads and motorised transport, the competitive advantage of camels was lost, and out-of-work Cameleers were often compelled into menial forms of employment. Some returned to their countries of origin. Most who stayed married into Aboriginal communities, while a few married European women who lived as Muslims. The Khan towns were gradually abandoned. As devout Muslims, the Afghans built simple local mosques along their earliest travel routes, the earliest recorded being that at Maree in South Australia, which we know from an 1854 photograph, a simple earthen and timber structure next to a pool used for ablutions. This building has since been restored. A few other simple mosque structures have survived. Afghans built mosques in their Khan towns in country regions, and in 1888 constructed the first substantial metropolitan mosque in Australia in Adelaide. In 1905, 4 minarets were added. Substantial urban mosques were also built in Perth in 1905 and in Brisbane in 1908. Mosques were the focal points for Afghan communities. During Ramadan, Afghans from Australia's centre would converge on the Adelaide Mosque. They would stop work during the holy month and join together to fast and pray and enjoy the following Eid al-Fitr celebration. An enduring legacy of these ancestral interactions between Muslims from the Indonesian archipelago, the Indian subcontinent and the Middle East and the indigenous people are Aboriginal family names which exist today, such as Akbar, Ahmad, bin Bakar, bin Damin, bin Swami, Muhammad and Sultan. In the late 19th century, there were 2 more influxes of Muslim workers, Malays of diverse island origins who worked in the pearl shelling industry in Australia's northern seas, and Javanese Muslims who worked in the new sugarcane plantations in northeastern Queensland. Pearl diving became the largest industry in North Queensland by the 1890s, for which Malays were recruited. The industry spread around the northern coast, Broome in Western Australia becoming the world's major centre and home to various cultures, including Malays, who in the 1930s built a small mosque there. Malays formed long-standing relationships with Indigenous people across the top end of the country. A significant number married local Aboriginal women, and today there are many Aboriginal Malay people in this vast region. The Javanese Muslims were brought as labourers on the sugarcane plantations of northeastern Queensland, centred around Mackay. A pioneering British grower who had worked in Java considered Javanese to be responsible workers and was instrumental in bringing some 2,000 of them by the mid-1880s. They lived in their own Muslim communities. Both women and men came together, observing Islamic religious and cultural practices. Some had made the Hajj to Mecca before coming to Australia. The first generation built in the styles of their homeland, including a bamboo and grass mosque.